Sir, the Endymion is closing on the port side. Continuous fire! Don't let them breathe! Gunpowder scorches the air. Splinters slice the soaked deck. Decatur, soot on his face, points. Load the 24-pounders! The hull groans. The Atlantic roars. The President chooses to live. The thunder of the cannons swallowed the sound of orders. The American frigate USS President sliced through the sea in desperate flight, while her hull shuddered under the impact of British shot. Gunpowder smoke blanketed the deck, and the smell of sulfur mingled with blood and brine. Commodore Stephen Decatur, steady at the helm, shouted for more fire, more courage, more speed. Ahead, the silhouette of the HMS Endymion grew like a stalking beast, swift, methodical, relentless. The President's sailors worked in tense silence, repeating trained motions to the point of exhaustion. They loaded, cleaned, and adjusted the angle of the 24-pounder cannons, while the ship pitched under the weight of waves and impacts. Each broadside tore a shower of splinters from the enemy deck, but the British pressed on, disciplined and confident in their numerical advantage. Decatur knew he was isolated. The British blockade of New York had closed, and there was no longer an escape route. The previous night had been a disaster. Attempting to exit Sandy Hook Bar, the President had run aground on treacherous sands, suffering serious damage to her keel and rudder. When she finally broke free, the frigate was already maneuvering with difficulty, dragging the shame of having been wounded before the battle even began. Now every maneuver was a calculated risk, and every minute of delay brought the other British frigates, Pomone, Tenedos, and Majestic, closer in pursuit. Even so, Decatur did not consider surrender. To him, the name President meant more than wood and iron. It was the pride of a nation that had challenged empires. He recalled the victories of her sisters, Constitution, and United States, which had humiliated British ships in direct combat. If those frigates had defeated the enemy, why couldn't the President do the same? The American commander looked at his crew and saw the same question in their eyes. The first direct hit from the Endymion snapped the mizzenmast and spread fire across the deck. Men rushed with buckets and blankets, smothering the flames while others continued firing. The cries of the wounded mingled with the roar of cannons and the cracking of splintering wood. The fight had become personal. No sailor there wanted to be remembered as the man who fled. The American flag, still fluttering atop the mast, seemed like an insult to the British squadron. The duel turned into a spectacle of endurance. The President, wounded and slow, managed to respond blow for blow. The Endymion's hull began to show deep scars, and her fire lost its rhythm. British observers later admitted they had never seen a frigate fight so long under such conditions. Every minute Decatur gained was a moral victory, but he knew he couldn't sustain it forever. The sails were torn, ammunition was dwindling, and the wind blew against him. Around 5 in the afternoon, the battle reached its climax. The two frigates sailed side by side, exchanging shots almost point blank. The air was thick with smoke and screams, and the sea around them boiled with the impact of shot. Decatur realized the Endymion had slowed, her rudder had been hit. A flash of hope swept the American deck. "She's stopping!" someone shouted, but the relief was short-lived. In the distance, the other British sails appeared on the horizon, closing the trap. The President's crew was exhausted, covered in soot, blood, and salt. Many could barely load the cannons anymore. The ship's surgeon, surrounded by wounded, improvised bandages from scraps of cloth. Decatur gathered his officers and looked around. The ship still floated, but each new impact pushed her to the brink. He could keep fighting and lose everyone, or surrender with honor after inflicting serious damage on the enemy. It was a cruel but inevitable choice. As night fell, the Commodore ordered ceasefire. The silence after hours of thunder was almost unbearable. The enemy approached slowly, lighting the sea with lanterns. The President had kept her promise. She had fought to the end, damaged the British Navy's finest frigate, and forced an entire squadron to pursue her. When the flag was struck, there was no shame, only respect.
Even the British, upon boarding, acknowledged the feat.
That icy winter night would be the beginning of the end. Humphreys had created a perfect machine, and Decatur had inherited command of a legend. But the sea is merciless to the proud. What began as another raiding mission soon transformed into a legendary duel, the kind of battle that defines not just the fate of a ship, but of an entire era. When the War of 1812 began, the United States knew it was challenging the world's greatest naval power. The Royal Navy possessed hundreds of ships of the line, experienced and disciplined. The Americans had few frigates, but of unquestionable quality. Among them, the President was seen as the supreme trump card, fast, resilient, and with firepower capable of destroying any rival of her class. She was the key piece in a bold strategy, to strike directly at British pride on the seas. The American Navy knew it couldn't win by numbers, so it bet on symbolic victories. Each duel won against a British frigate carried immense political and moral weight. When the Constitution defeated the Guerriere, the world realized the balance of power was shifting. The President was assigned to follow the same path, hunting convoys and testing the British blockade. She was the armed arm of a country determined to be respected. The North Atlantic became a dangerous chessboard. British convoys crossed the ocean in constant fear of American frigates. The President sailed with audacity, using her speed to strike and vanish before reinforcements arrived. Her sailors, veterans of Mediterranean campaigns, were trained for precision. Every shot counted, and every successful escape boosted the ship's reputation. London began calling her the Shadow of New York. But American confidence came at a price. Britain, irritated by the losses, decided to respond with force. In 1814, the Admiralty ordered a total blockade of the U.S. East Coast. No American frigate could leave port without facing an entire squadron. The siege was strategic, to strangle the economy and trap the ships before they could wreak havoc. New York, the President's main base, became a floating prison. For Decatur and his crew, this was the ultimate trial. They spent months watching the horizon, studying patrol patterns, awaiting the ideal moment to escape. Winter brought stronger winds and longer nights, ideal conditions to attempt the impossible. In early January 1815, the plan was drawn: break the blockade, cross the Atlantic, and attack British commerce. It was a desperate gamble, but also an act of pure courage. On the night of January 14, 1815, New York Harbor slept under a dense fog. The President glided silently, her sails furled to avoid the moonlight's gleam. On board, Decatur watched the bar with apprehension. The plan was simple: slip past undetected before dawn. But the sea rarely respects human plans. A treacherous current veered the ship, and within minutes, the frigate grounded violently on the shallow sands of Sandy Hook. The impact was brutal. The hull groaned as if alive, cracking in several places. Sailors rushed to lighten her, throwing supplies and even smaller cannons overboard. For nearly 2 hours, the ship fought her own fate, rocking like a wounded animal. When she finally broke free, the damage was severe. The rudder was compromised, and the whole bottom seriously deformed. Even so, Decatur ordered to press on. At dawn, the sails were hoisted again. The President advanced with wounded dignity, but still with a fighting spirit. The commander knew the British would soon notice her absence, so he ordered maximum speed. The wind blew cold and biting, and each snap of the sails reminded the crew of their vulnerability. The frigate headed into the open Atlantic, seeking freedom and perhaps glory. However, the enemy was not long in noticing. A few hours later, British lookouts spotted the President's silhouette in the distance. Messengers raced between the blockade frigates, and within minutes, the hunt began. Leading was the HMS Endymion.
the swiftest of all, commanded by Captain Henry Hope. The chase stretched for miles, with the wind pushing both vessels towards an inevitable fate.
Decatur watched the enemy's approach with tense calm. He knew escape was impossible, but he had no intention of surrendering. He ordered weight redistributed, the 24-pounders prepared, and fire concentrated on the British masts. "If we can't flee, we'll make history," he said, his voice steady. The crew nodded in silence. The Atlantic awaited another legendary battle, and the President was ready to fight to the end. The sea dawned heavy, with high waves and cutting wind. The President sailed wounded, dragging her damaged keel like an open scar. Behind her, the Endymion gained ground, propelled by favorable wind and British tenacity. The rising sun illuminated the foamy wake of the two frigates, as if the ocean marked the path of the hunt. The duel had not yet begun, but all knew it was only a matter of time. Decatur kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, assessing every mile gained. The crew worked in disciplined silence, adjusting sails and redistributing weight to compensate for the damage. Men sweated despite the biting cold, while the ship creaked in protest. The commander knew the President couldn't maintain that pace for long, but stubborn hope was that the darkness of the next night would bring salvation. The Endymion approached slowly, like a patient predator. Captain Henry Hope knew the fame of American frigates and wanted to prove British superiority once and for all. He ordered his gunners to prepare, but held fire until closing the distance. He wanted the first accurate shot, the one that would mark the start of the legend. The tense silence between the two crews seemed to presage thunder. When the distance narrowed enough, the first cannon roared. The blast reverberated like metallic thunder, followed by a shower of splinters and smoke. The President responded immediately, and the entire Atlantic seemed to light up. Shot crossed the air in invisible trajectories, masts splintered, and the noise of impacts mingled with the sound of waves. The battle had begun, and neither ship intended to yield. For hours the frigates dueled in parallel, holding the same course. The Endymion, lighter, maneuvered better. The President, heavier, endured more punishment. The American deck turned into chaos of orders, screams, and smoke. Men were wounded and replaced without pause. Decatur shouted commands in a hoarse voice, and each broadside echoed like a steel heartbeat. It was the kind of combat that forged reputations and shattered hopes. As the afternoon wore on, the Endymion attempted to cross the President's bow for a raking shot, the most devastating blow a frigate could suffer. Decatur spotted the maneuver and reacted with impressive speed, ordering an abrupt turn that made the ship groan to her limits. The American broadside roared almost simultaneously, and the shot struck the British hull full on. The impact made the Endymion shudder as if struck by an earthquake. For a moment the sea seemed suspended in time. The Endymion slowed, her torn sails fluttering like warning flags. Captain Hope was wounded by splinters, but refused to leave his post. "Keep up the fire," he shouted, as blood trickled down his uniform. From the other side, Decatur watched with respect. He knew he faced a worthy opponent, but he also understood that fatigue would soon overcome him. The following hours were torment. The President had suffered serious damage to her rudder and sails, limiting her maneuvers. The crew, exhausted, struggled to maintain the cannon rhythm. Ropes were soaked in sweat and brine, and the air smelled of scorched iron. Even so, the sailors did not falter. Each shot was a declaration of resistance, a message to the world that the young American nation did not bend easily.
The Endymion, in turn, was partially dismasted. Her mainmast was destroyed and much of her artillery disabled. Even so, she kept firing, sustained by her crew's stubbornness. The duel turned into a contest of pure will. Neither commander wanted to be the first to yield. Each cannon salvo was met with cheers, even as the deck trembled under enemy fire. Around 7 at night, the wind died down and the sea calmed. Both frigates floated mutilated, shrouded in smoke and silence. The Endymion drifted, but alive. The President, spent, tried to pull away before the other British frigates arrived. Decatur looked around and saw his ship's state: broken masts, wounded everywhere, and ammunition nearly gone. The American hero knew time was up, but honor remained intact. Night fell over the Atlantic with a somber silence. Cannon smoke hung over the sea like fog, and the sound of waves seemed louder than ever. The President rocked heavily, her sails in tatters, and the deck covered in wounded. The surgeon worked by lantern light, trying to save men amid screams and blood. The smell of gunpowder, sweat, and charred wood dominated the air. Decatur knew the battle was lost. His officers, exhausted, awaited a decision. The Endymion drifted, but the other British frigates were already approaching on the horizon, Pomone and Tenedos coming at full force. The commander surveyed the ship. Over 100 wounded, broken masts, and ammunition nearly exhausted. He took a deep breath, faced his men, and realized continuing to fight would be suicide. Even so, his voice lost none of its firmness. "Men of the President," Decatur shouted, "we fought like Americans, and there is no shame in surviving with honor." The crew fell silent, eyes fixed on him, understanding what was coming. The orders were given with dignity: cease fire, strike the colors, prepare a white flag. None present bowed their heads. The surrender was inevitable, but pride remained intact. The President might fall, but she would not bend without respect. As the British approached, the sea reflected the glow of lanterns in an almost ghostly scene. English officers boarded cautiously, expecting resistance, but found only silence and discipline. One looked around, impressed by the frigate's state. "Mr. Decatur, you fought bravely," he said with a slight nod. The American commander replied only with a steady gaze. He had lost the ship, but not the honor. The next morning, the wounded were removed and the sea seemed calm, as if the ocean mourned the loss of a legend. The American flag was struck, folded carefully, and handed to the youngest officer. No one spoke during the process. Even the British kept silent. The President was defeated, but her reputation had already crossed the Atlantic. The name of that ship would be remembered long beyond that war. The capture of the President had an immediate impact on both nations. For Americans, it was a blow to pride, but also proof of courage. No British ship had fought so hard to take a lone frigate. In U.S. newspapers, the surrender was described as heroic, and Decatur became a symbol of resistance. Even as a prisoner, his name was celebrated as that of the man who faced the empire and made history. In Britain, the sentiment was mixed. The victory was clear, but the cost had been high. The Endymion, badly damaged, had to be towed back to port. British officers publicly acknowledged American bravery, something rare in that era. Many stated that the President had been the most formidable opponent ever faced by the Royal Navy in open sea. It was the admission of respect few enemies could wrest from the British. Upon arriving in England, the President was displayed as a war trophy in Portsmouth. Thousands of curious onlookers gathered to see the ship that had challenged the Empire's maritime power. But unlike other captures, this one was not met with arrogance. Royal Navy engineers and officers studied every detail of the American hull. They were impressed by her resilience, reinforced structure, and armament efficiency.
The impact was so great that the Royal Navy decided to build a replica. In 1829, a new ship was launched with the same name, HMS President, a tribute, and, in a way, a confession. It was silent acknowledgement that the American design had surpassed European standards. The British copy would sail the same seas, bearing the name of the enemy they most feared. The symbol of defeat had transformed into homage. For Decatur, the fate was bittersweet. Released sometime later, he returned to the United States as a hero. Received with honors, he refused any attempt to downplay his surrender. Honor is not measured by victory, but by the courage to fight even when it is impossible, he declared. His words summed up the spirit of the President,
a vessel born to challenge and died without ever surrendering in spirit. In the United States, news of the president's fall spread rapidly, crossing newspapers and taverns from coast to coast. Many mourned, but no one called the episode a defeat. On the contrary, the frigate's heroic resistance was celebrated as an example of the American spirit. In a young country still seeking identity amid empires, the courage of Decatur and his men served as a symbol of national maturity. It was proof that America could face the world on equal terms. Accounts of the confrontation arrived with striking details. Stories circulated of wounded sailors fighting on, cannons operated to the last shot, officers refusing to leave the deck. Each tale fed the myth. The president had become more than a ship. She was now an idea. She represented the audacity and stubbornness of a people still building their navy, but already demanding respect. The Atlantic Ocean ceased to be the exclusive domain of the British Crown. The American government, aware of the symbolic impact, used the episode as a diplomatic tool. As peace treaties were negotiated, the president's name echoed in speeches and official correspondence. It was not just about the battle's outcome, but how it was fought. National pride grew, and with it, the awareness that the country needed a stronger navy to protect its commerce and future. In shipyards, engineers and carpenters began studying Humphreys' design with reverence. The original 6 frigates became objects of admiration and study. Each detail of the president's structure was revisited. The whole shape, cannon placement, balance between weight and speed. These elements would form the basis of the next generation of American warships. Defeat had transformed into the seed of rebirth. And for the people, there was something deeper. The name President became synonymous with bravery. On coasts and in ports, sailors told the story with pride. The echo of the battle against the Endymion did not fade. It was recounted as if it were a foundational tale, a moment when the American spirit proved it could bleed but not break. And in every naval ensign raised thereafter, the ghost of the president sailed, silent and eternal. The success and tragedy of the 44-gun frigates changed forever the United States' view of naval power. Before, the country saw the Navy as a secondary instrument. After the president, it came to view it as a vital line of defense. The War of 1812 had shown that mastering the sea was as important as winning on land. American frigates proved that ingenuity could compensate for a lack of numbers. The sea now became part of the national identity. The original 6 became legendary: United States, Constitution, Constellation, Congress, Chesapeake, and President, each with her own story of glory and sacrifice. The Constitution, Old Ironsides, survived and remains a living symbol of that era. But the President remained the ultimate example of resistance. Her heroic end completed the cycle begun by Humphreys and solidified the concept of the heavy American frigate, an innovation that would influence decades of naval design. The legacy of these vessels crossed borders. In Europe, British and French engineers began copying structural elements of the American frigates. The use of reinforced oak, armament distribution, and balance between speed and armor became international standards. The War of 1812, though small in scale, was a naval laboratory that redefined the future of 19th-century navies. The president, even captured, was an essential part of that transformation.
For sailors, the impact was even more emotional. The generation that served on American frigates developed a unique sense of identity, a brotherhood forged in violent seas and impossible decisions. Stories of Decatur and his men inspired new waves of officers determined to carry on the legacy. The United States Navy emerged from the conflict more professional, disciplined, and aware of its role in the world. And so the age of frigates ended with a mix of glory and mourning. The president had fallen, but her name echoed in every port and shipyard. The sound of her cannons still seemed to reverberate in the memories of those who lived that war.
When new generations of sailors embarked toward the unknown, they carried the same motto Decatur whispered before surrender: "As long as there is sea, there will be honor." After her capture, the President crossed the Atlantic under British colors, towed like a wounded trophy. Her hull, marked by dozens of impacts, drew attention in the ports she passed. British sailors, accustomed to the arrogance of easy victories, observed the enemy ship that had cost them so dearly in silence. In Portsmouth, crowds gathered to see the legendary American frigate, and many were surprised by her size and robustness. She was different, more solid, more imposing. Royal Navy engineers wasted no time. They inspected every part of the President, measuring the angle of her curves, the deck weight, the plank thickness. It was almost reverent work. They discovered that American white oak had unusual resilience and absorbed shot impacts better. They also noted that the cannon distribution and ship balance were superior to European standards. The President left lessons, even in defeat. In 1829, 14 years after the battle, the British Admiralty launched a new frigate, the HMS President. It was an almost exact replica of the original American. The British copy would sail the same seas, but carried a paradox, created in homage to the enemy. The gesture, though subtle, was symbolic. It showed that even Britain, proud of her supremacy, recognized the merit of American design and courage. The President's legend had crossed borders. The new HMS President served as a training ship and in diplomatic missions, becoming a familiar sight along European coasts. But among her crew ran a curious rumor. They said the ship was haunted. Some swore they heard footsteps on deck at night, the sound of distant cannons, or a firm voice shouting orders in American English. It was as if Commodore Decatur's spirit still walked the planks, reminding all that the ship was born of a republic's pride. Over the years, the myth blended with history. The original President vanished, dismantled and forgotten, but her shadow remained. Sailors and historians saw in her the start of a new era, the moment when the United States Navy ceased being a promise and became a power. Even transformed into a British copy, the President continued sailing, not in wood and sails, but in the memory of two peoples who learned to respect each other in fire. Stephen Decatur returned to the United States as a freed prisoner, but was received as a hero. His reputation had survived the defeat, and his name was etched alongside Paul Jones and Isaac Hull in American naval history. In Washington banquets, he was treated as a symbol of bravery and patriotism. When asked about the surrender, he replied with serenity, "A commander's duty is to save lives when victory is impossible." His phrase became a maxim among sailors. Decatur continued serving in the Navy, but never forgot the President's deck. In personal letters, he described the smell of gunpowder and the sound of screams mingled with the wind. He said every battle left invisible scars, that true glory lay in discipline and loyalty. Despite honors and promotions, he remained modest, refusing to turn his story into a spectacle. For him, the sea forgave no vanity, only courage. His career, however, would end tragically. In 1820, he became involved in a duel with another American officer, Commodore James Barron, over an old matter of honor. The confrontation ended with Decatur mortally wounded. He died at home at age 41, surrounded by friends and officers who mourned the loss of one of the United States' greatest naval heroes. His death shocked the nation, and marked the end of a generation raised under the roar of 1812's cannons.
Even after his death, the name Decatur lived on in the waters. Cities, ships, and even military schools bore his name. The Navy considered him the ultimate example of conduct, a man who united bravery and compassion. His writings on discipline and naval tactics became required reading for trainee officers. He left no children, but a legacy that would shape the soul of the American Navy. When the old Ironsides, the USS Constitution, was restored decades later, veterans recalled Decatur and the President as the pillars of that era. "They gave us pride in being American sailors," one officer said at his funeral. And indeed they did. Because in the end, what Stephen Decatur represented was not just a victorious or defeated commander. It was the embodiment of the American spirit in its purest form, resilient, audacious, and immortal. The fall of the President did not mark the end of the American Navy, but the beginning of a new era. In the years following the War of 1812, Congress understood that the United States needed a permanent naval force. The heroic victories and honorable defeats served as harsh but necessary lessons. New shipyards were built, and the country began investing in naval technology. The ocean ceased being a threat and became a field of dominance. Engineers studied everything learned from the 44-gun frigates. Construction techniques, American oak resilience, and balance between weight and speed became the foundation for the future. The country began thinking big, larger ships, greater range, more efficient artillery. Humphreys' ideas survived, evolved, and inspired new generations of builders. The concept of agile yet powerful force solidified as American naval doctrine. In the world, the impact was visible. European powers began respecting the United States as an emerging maritime power. No British admiral would again underestimate an American frigate. The President episode and the fear caused by the 44s became case studies in the naval academies of London and Paris. America had proven that innovation and courage could challenge tradition and numbers. The balance of the seas, if only for a moment, had been questioned. For the people, the sea came to represent freedom and national pride. Port songs spoke of 1812's heroes, ships that fought the impossible, and flags that never fell. The President was in every one of those stories. Even lost, she had become a symbol of what the country aspired to be: strong, respected, and indomitable. Every ship launched in the following decades carried a bit of her soul in the planks and masts. With the advance of the industrial era, steam began replacing wind, but the President's memory did not fade. On the contrary, it became inspiration for the first cruisers and ironclads of the 19th century. Her name was recalled in officers' speeches and christening ceremonies. Because before machines, before propellers and iron, there was oak, wind, and fire, and a ship that taught America to fight as a nation of the seas. Over the decades, the name President reappeared in various American Navy vessels. Each new ship bearing the title was an homage to the lost frigate of 1815. Sailors saw it as a sacred honor, a continuity of spirit. And every time one of those ships set sail, officers remembered the story of Commodore Decatur and his men who had faced the impossible with dignity. The name was a constant reminder of courage under fire. In museums and naval academies, the President's story became an essential part of new officers' training. Models, paintings, and detailed accounts showed the battle with the Endymion as an example of command under pressure. In classrooms, instructors explained how Decatur maintained crew morale, even in disadvantage. A commander is measured not when he wins, but when he keeps his crew united in the face of defeat, it was said on the walls of the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. The British, for their part, maintained respect for the enemy that nearly escaped them. Official documents and letters reveal sincere admiration for American skill and Humphreys' frigate design. The episode between President and Endymion is still studied today as a classic example of a balanced naval duel. It was the kind of confrontation that turned enemies into mutual references, where respect replaced arrogance. The sea, after all, is the greatest equalizer of all.
Time, however, transformed the myth into a distant memory. When the 19th century ended, the age of sail slowly faded. Steam and steel took the oceans, and old frigates became museum relics. Yet the President survived in the popular imagination. Poets and chroniclers described her last battle as the day the sea had two winners. The frigate spirit still sailed in stories told in taverns and ports. In 1900, when the United States launched its first modern battleships, veteran officers cited the President during ceremonies. "It was she who taught us to fight empires," an admiral said, raising a glass of rum. And he was right, because the value of a legend is not measured by the wood that rots, but by the example that withstands time. The President may have sunk in 1815, but her courage still floated on every American wave. The sun set on the Atlantic as the legacy of the USS President finally found rest in history. The sea, which had been the stage of her glory and tragedy, remained the same, vast, unpredictable, and indifferent to human feats. But for those who knew her story, every wave carried a distant echo of 1815's cannons. The frigate that faced the Empire with solitary courage had transformed into legend, more powerful than any victory. Time, instead of erasing her, immortalized her. In naval academies, her name came to symbolize the quiet valor of resistance, not the theatrical heroism of victories, but the austere heroism of those who fight to the limit. Decades later, when new ships crossed oceans under the American flag, veteran officers recalled the President before each battle. "Fight as she fought," was the phrase repeated on decks. The frigate's story had become doctrine, a reminder that honor is not measured by the outcome, but by persistence. For the British, the memory of the President also carried respect. The replica, built in 1829, the HMS President, sailed for nearly a century, becoming a symbol of a victory that was not arrogant but admired. On every voyage, British sailors knew they were aboard a ship born of the adversary's talent. And perhaps for that reason, the name survived so well on both sides of the ocean as testimony to a rivalry that ended in mutual recognition. In the United States, the name President returned in new vessels, aircraft, and even symbolic spacecraft. The spirit of Decatur and his crew transcended time and technology. When the American Navy reached the Pacific Seas and then space, it carried the same philosophy born in 1815. Fight with intelligence, resist with honor, and fall only when no other choice remains. The President's DNA lived on in every American steel that cut the horizon. And so the legend found the silence it deserved. The sea erased the battle scars, but not the memory of those who fought it. The USS President was more than a ship. She was a lesson in pride, courage, and sacrifice. Her hull was lost, but her story became a moral compass for generations of sailors. Because as long as there is ocean, there will be men willing to face it. And among the rising and breaking waves, the echo of the President still answers, "Here we sail free."